I never thought that the first time I gazed upon my daughter, the small, fragile miracle I'd spent 9 endless months yearning to hold, would also mark the instant my whole existence started to unravel. After 18 grueling hours of labor, I cradled her for a mere 3 minutes before my husband, Brandon, yanked the birth certificate from the nurse's grasp. His expression was empty, icy, stripped of any feeling. Then he uttered words that broke me apart. "Her name is Joanne. That's what my mother chose, not that absurd name you came up with." I stood still, stunned. Those words weren't just a blow to my dignity. They were the final hammer strike shattering every hope I'd clung to about this man. My hand, still resting on the bed, curled into a tight fist, nails biting into my skin as my body shook from the agony of giving birth. "No," I murmured, my voice faint. "We agreed. We said Isla." Brandon didn't even glance back. He kept scribbling as if I didn't exist, his tone flat and uncaring. "You just gave birth. You're not thinking clearly. Let me take care of it." Each word stabbed like a dagger. In that moment, I wasn't his partner, nor even the mother of our child. I was merely a vessel that had served its purpose, a hollow shell. I tried to push myself up, but the pain from the stitches cut through me like shards of glass. I turned to the nurse, a woman in her 50s with silver-threaded hair and eyes as piercing as iron. She studied me for a long pause, then leaned closer and whispered, "Do you want the truth? There's still time if you're ready to confront it." I frowned, struggling to grasp her meaning. "What truth?" She didn't reply at once. Instead, she flicked her gaze toward Brandon, still hunched over the form as if he were alone in the room, then back to me. Her eyes carried not pity but a stark caution. "When he steps out, I'll show you what was rightfully yours." I stared at her, sensing something beyond mere concern, something forged from wisdom, a signal, a call to rise. The postpartum pain faded not because I'd recovered, but because dread had swallowed every other feeling. Brandon had orchestrated this, and I began to see he wasn't just seizing control of her name. There was something deeper, something sinister. I shifted my gaze to my daughter, resting serenely in the cradle beside me. She was my only anchor, but if I didn't act soon, I might lose more than her name, her whole future, my claim as her mother. Once I'd seen Brandon as the perfect man, steady, thoughtful, compassionate, and above all, attentive. In a world of men who speak too much and hear too little, he seemed a rare gem. Early on, he'd ask about my aspirations, my work, the pieces of me that defined who I was. When I said I rejected conventional roles for wives, he nodded. When I told him I'd keep my last name after marriage, he smiled. When I confessed my mother's controlling nature had distanced us, he took my hand and murmured, "I understand." But perhaps all he truly understood was how to stay silent when his mother spoke. I met Irene Kessler at Brandon's grandfather's 80th birthday celebration. I wore a rich green velvet dress and entered the Riverside estate on Brandon's arm, presented as his girlfriend. The moment I crossed the threshold, her gaze latched onto me, cold, calculating, dissecting. "Oh," she said, sipping her martini, "so you're a financial consultant? The kind of job where you stare at spreadsheets all day." I smiled courteously. "I do corporate strategy consulting, mostly in tech." She nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on my earrings. "Tech. Not quite the career of someone who attended an Ivy League school." I caught the weight she placed on attended. Brandon said nothing. No defense, no comment, just pressed my hand lightly under the table so faint it barely registered. I was too naive then to see that squeeze wasn't comfort. It was a quiet plea. Don't cause a stir. From that day I began to grasp Irene's power. She didn't need many words to command. She wielded looks, smirks, and single-line remarks sharp enough to hush a crowd. With Brandon, she didn't issue orders. She was the order. I was an outsider, a flaw in the meticulously crafted destiny she'd designed for her son. Over our 3 years together, Irene never used my name. That girl, the frizzy one, the one in dark clothes. Her labels shifted with her whims, but Ariel never crossed her lips. To her, I was a misstep. A woman from an unremarkable family, not Ivy League, not tied to influential allies, too driven to be submissive, too forthright to be tamed, too self-reliant to be trusted. I tried to be patient, convincing myself she'd warm to me if I showed my love for Brandon, if I stayed polite, poised, respectful. But I didn't realize that to women like Irene, love isn't freely granted. It must be sanctioned. When Brandon proposed with a platinum ring bearing a deep blue sapphire, a stone I'd adored since I was young, I thought at last he's choosing for himself. I wept in his arms, overcome. But days later, that joy evaporated when Irene saw the ring at her home during dinner. "You didn't consult me first?" she asked, her voice chilling the room. Brandon stammered, "I thought it fit Ariel." She scowled. "Sapphire? Looks like a trinket from a flea market. Is this an engagement or a costume party?" I wanted to walk out, but I stayed. I squeezed Brandon's hand under the table. This time it felt clammy, limp, dead. When we bought a quaint house in a Charleston suburb, Irene sneered at the neighborhood for reeking of takeout and called the kitchen a servant's space. On moving day, she arrived with 3 suitcases, not to offer gifts but to stay 3 nights, helping Brandon arrange things properly. I still recall the helplessness as she strode into our bedroom, flung open my closet and declared, "This girl's taste is a mess. My son deserves better." I looked to Brandon, waiting for him to speak. He gave a weak smile and a wink. "Mom's just being honest. Don't take it to heart." That line extinguished something in me, not because it stung but because I saw I'd never be shielded. When I got pregnant, Irene became relentless. She called daily to monitor my diet, then appeared to rummage through our fridge. Once she tossed out strawberries, claiming, "Cold fruit constricts the womb." She even handed me a tattered notebook labeled Brandon's Pregnancy Diet, 1991. Brandon chuckled when I showed it to him. "She's just concerned. Don't dwell on it." And the name Isla, the one I'd cherished in my journal since I was 20, dreaming of motherhood, Brandon had once said he loved. But after a single dinner at his mother's, he looked at me blankly and said, "Joan makes more sense. It's Grandma's name. Tradition." No debate, no warmth. I knew then that everything I'd thought I was part of was a facade. Now, lying in this hospital bed, watching Brandon etch that name onto our daughter's birth certificate, I wasn't furious anymore. I was frozen, chilled to my core. I couldn't recall how long Brandon had been gone, only that the room sank into an eerie quiet after he left. Every sound, the beep of the monitor, the rumble of a stretcher in the hall, grew louder in my ears. I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, my mind blank, yet deep inside I knew I was waiting, for answers, for proof, for confirmation this horror was real. Marcia, the nurse, returned with a slim folder clutched tightly. Her face no longer held its earlier softness. It was the guarded look of someone who knew she carried dynamite. She pulled a chair near, sat and set the file on the table beside me. "I think you should see this now before it's all sealed and too late to change." I didn't speak, just nodded. A tide of unease surged within me, pulling me under. Marcia flipped open the first page. A health insurance form. In bold print, Brandon Kessler, primary policy holder, primary parent. My name was absent. Not as secondary, not as co-beneficiary, not even noted. I blinked, thinking I'd misread, but it was stark, intentional. Brandon alone was recognized, as if I'd never been. She turned to the next page. A draft birth certificate. Father fully completed. Mother empty, not a mark, not a letter. What is this?" I whispered, my throat tightening. "There's got to be a mistake." Marcia shook her head gently. "No errors. It's based on the insurance data he submitted. If you don't correct it within 48 hours, it's locked into the state system." I looked away. In that instant I felt myself being wiped from my own life. One omitted name erasing my identity, my role, my motherhood. Marcia reached into the folder's side pocket and pulled out a yellow envelope, clipped shut. I found this with the documents he filed. It's not hospital issued, but it was bundled with the insurance papers. I opened it. Inside, a 2-page legal document stared back, its title cold and cutting. Custody Contingency Agreement Prenatal, drafted by Irene Kessler and Associates. Ice flooded my chest. It read, if the mother is unable to fulfill parental duties post-birth due to medical, psychological, or fatal complications, full custody and legal authority will be granted solely to the biological father, Brandon Kessler. No consent from me, no assessments, no need for my approval. Before I could react, the door creaked. Brandon entered, coffee in hand, and froze when he saw the agreement in my grip. His eyes darted to the folder, then to me, shifting from shock to worry to defiance. I didn't need to ask or accuse. My voice was eerily steady. When were you planning to erase me from our daughter's life? He didn't answer immediately, setting the cup down. Mom just wanted to be ready in case something went wrong. You're overreacting. I let out a brittle, piercing laugh. Ready? I'm lying here, fresh from surgery, my body still aching and torn, and you call stripping me from my child's life being ready? Brandon swallowed, his eyes wavering, but he pressed on. Just. Mom thought if something happened. I cut him off, my voice like iron. Mom thought. What about you? Did you think, or did you just nod and sign whatever she handed you? He fell silent, no defense left. In that quiet, I saw something more chilling than betrayal. Brandon had no backbone. He didn't choose me or her. He chose the easiest route, letting his mother dictate it all. I looked at the papers. A calculated scheme to erase me from Esla's life, masked as precaution, complete with signatures, timelines, contingencies. And I'd never been consulted. I turned to Marcia, my tone low but firm. I just stepped out of a snare, built with contracts and lawyers. But they missed one thing. I pressed a hand to my abdomen where the incision still seared and said, no one else bled for this child. No one lay awake, terrified her heartbeat would fade. No one risked their body, their sanity, their tomorrow. I did. And they thought a pen could undo me? They're mistaken. Brandon said nothing, retreating, eyes flickering like a man disarmed. I didn't yet know how I'd fight, but I knew this. I wouldn't stay quiet. From here on, everything would shift. No more silent concessions, no more peace at my expense, no more bowing to tradition. If you were Ariel, discovering your husband and mother-in-law schemed to erase you from your daughter's life, would you stay silent or push back? Let me know your thoughts and stay tuned. Ariel's not retreating. She's about to do something no one anticipated. I sat still on the hospital bed, gripping the folder of evidence Brandon had tried to bury. But even with the unbearable truth I'd uncovered, I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't the end. From the start, I'd felt another shadow in our marriage. Irene, the woman Brandon revered to the point of oblivion. I remembered her scrutinizing stares, her words airy yet dripping with disdain. Modern women like you only know how to argue. Do you even grasp what holds a family together? Brandon would nod along. I chalked it up to a generational divide, but now I wondered if it was ever that simple. A memory sparked, something trivial then, vital now. Last year I'd set up a backup email for Brandon when he lost his work account. I created it, chose the password, linked it to my phone for security. He never bothered to update it, calling it just for emergencies. I grabbed my phone, opened the email app and entered the familiar password. Logged in instantly. At first, just mundane notifications, work alerts, spam. Then I saw the forwarded mail folder. Copies from his main account. One name repeated, Delilah Ward, his assistant. A polished young woman, always polite yet never warm to me. I dismissed it as petty envy, but now every glance, every moment she lingered near Brandon replayed like a film of treachery. I opened an email. See you tonight. It started with project talk, but below in italics. I'll go ahead as usual. Just say you're working late. Your mom's already set everything up. Your mom. Another email with an attachment, a screenshot of texts between Delilah and Irene home. Delilah wrote, "I finished the paperwork you wanted. Ariel suspects nothing. She's just the surrogate now." I went numb. Another from Irene. "Women like Delilah uphold family tradition. Ariel only resists. Replacing her is right." My hands shook, my pulse thundering. This wasn't jealousy, it was a conspiracy. Irene hadn't just controlled Brandon. She'd groomed Delilah to supplant me step by step while I carried our child in pain. They'd plotted to erase me from her life. I didn't scream or weep. I inhaled deeply. Each piece of evidence was a weapon. I asked Marcia to print the emails page by page from the hospital printer. Undeniable proof of betrayal, manipulation, cruelty from those I'd once called family. He handed me the stack. I placed it in a folder, hands trembling but eyes clear. It wasn't just papers, it was power. On the label I wrote, "Truth." I looked at Isla sleeping soundly. None of them, Brandon, Irene, Delilah, had the right to take her. I'd lost trust, but not my daughter. If they thought I'd yield as I had for 3 years, they'd forgotten. I bore this child with my blood, my life. No one would steal my motherhood. That afternoon, as I finished nursing Isla, I heard heels clicking down the hall. Slow, deliberate, a warning in each step. I didn't need to look to know it was Irene. The door creaked open. She stood there, hair perfect, face composed, not a flaw in sight. No smile, no greeting. Her eyes skimmed me, then settled on Isla. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded. No defiance, no assent. Just met her gaze, calmer than I'd ever imagined I could be. She stepped in like she owned the room, pulled a chair close, sat with arms crossed, her voice light as a whisper. "I came for the child, not to hash out whatever's between you and Brandon. That's for later." I stayed silent. She pressed on. "Ariel, I get that you're upset, but be rational. Stress harms the baby. I'm not faulting you for snooping, but everything was for her future." I tilted my head, keeping my tone even. "So, for her future, you thought wiping me from the records was fair?" Irene smiled, not warmly but with the confidence of someone still holding the reins. "We needed stability. A biological mother isn't always best suited to raise a child. You've lost control, you're unstable. Hand the responsibility to someone more capable." I let out a dry, cutting laugh but held back a reply. Instead, I glanced at the door as my mother, Marie, entered. No fancy attire, no makeup, just eyes ablaze with resolve, a black document case in hand. She stepped forward, placed it beside me, and faced Irene, calm but unyielding. "If you're finished, I'd like to speak for my daughter. She's recovering from surgery and needs to be a mother, not lectured." Irene's composure faltered, but she kept her voice soft. "You're meddling in my family's business." My mother didn't shout, she didn't need to. Her words landed like blows. "I'm guarding my daughter, something you never did for your son. Here's what you need to see." She opened the case. A falsified birth certificate draft, an insurance policy omitting me, an illegal custody agreement, printed emails of infidelity, every exchange between Irene and Brandon I'd gathered with Marcia's aid, and divorce papers from my mother's lawyer, crafted to shield Isla and me fully. Brandon walked in as the last page hit the table. He froze, staring at the evidence, undeniable now. But I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Irene, my voice low and sharp as glass. "I'm not begging to be a mother. I'm taking that right back, not with tears, not with pleas, but with truth and law." Irene clutched her purse, lips quivering with rage. "My son will lose everything because of you. You don't even see what you're ruining." I shook my head, unflinching. "No, you ruined it. You didn't want a daughter-in-law, you wanted a puppet. Too bad I'm not that woman." I turned to Brandon, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. "I thought you were a good man, but you're just a boy who never learned to stand up, only to obey your mother." He said nothing, no defense, no shield for Irene, just stood mute knowing I'd seen it all. This time I wouldn't let anyone erase me. News of our divorce didn't stay hushed as Brandon hoped. Within 3 weeks, court documents leaked via a legal acquaintance of my mother's, outraged at my name's omission from my child's birth certificate. The first piece hit a family law journal, Erased Mother, a legal manipulation shaking women's rights. What followed was a deluge: messages, emails, affair evidence from the proceedings, dragging Irene's name into the open. Once lauded as a pillar of tradition, she now faced public scorn, stepping down from her nonprofit board as partners cut ties and publications scrubbed her name. Brandon lost his job 2 months later. His firm cited a public ethics clause, distancing itself from a man exposed plotting custody theft in a hospital room. I didn't rejoice, nor did I pity them. They reaped what they'd sown against me. A year later, I live in Austin, Texas, in a sunny 2-bedroom apartment. I run my own financial consulting firm from home, an ambition once buried under household duties. No one halts me, doubts me, or reduces me to Irene Kessler's daughter-in-law. My daughter's surname is now Isla Morgan Langdon, chosen by my hand, affirmed by court order. Brandon and Irene are barred from contact. No visits, no gifts, no calls. Isla is mine alone. Single motherhood isn't simple. Some nights I soothe her fever until dawn. Some days I juggle clients while holding her, typing one-handed. But when I falter, I recall that day, the blank space beside mother, and know every struggle is worth it. One autumn afternoon, Isla brought home a crayon drawing from daycare. A woman in a red dress holding a girl, scribbled words beside it. "Mommy is my hero." I said nothing, just sat, hugged her, and kissed her forehead for a long while. That night I wrote in my journal, "They erased my name from the papers. I wrote it back with my hands and the life I built for my daughter." One more line for me: not every suit wearer provides. Some bear C-section scars and still craft whole worlds. Thanks for staying with Ariel's journey to the end. If her resilience moved you, stick around for more raw, real stories. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes one voice is all it takes to remind us we're not alone.